I was floating in crystal-clear turquoise water, a mango daiquiri in one hand and my phone in the other, when I saw the notification that changed everything. There on my screen was a photo of my entire family at the Magic Kingdom, grinning under Cinderella's castle, with the caption, "Best family vacation ever." The irony wasn't lost on me as I gazed out at my own private slice of paradise in the Bahamas, where the only magic happening was the kind that comes with complete freedom and unlimited room service. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. What they didn't know was that while they were standing in hour-long lines for a 3-minute ride, I was about to embark on a week that would cost more than their entire mortgage payment. What they also didn't know was that I had been planning this moment for longer than they could imagine, waiting for the perfect opportunity to show them exactly what they had thrown away when they decided I wasn't worth including in their carefully orchestrated family memories. The notification kept buzzing. More photos, more hashtags, more evidence of the vacation they had planned without me, funded without me, and executed without a single thought about the woman who had spent the last 32 years making sure their every dream came true. But here's the thing about being invisible to the people who are supposed to love you most. Sometimes it gives you the perfect vantage point to see exactly who they really are. My name is Crawford, and this is the story of how I discovered that being left behind was actually the greatest gift my family ever gave me. The morning it all began, I was exactly where I had been every morning for the past 3 decades, sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold while I organized everyone else's life. My planner lay open in front of me, color-coded and cross-referenced. A masterpiece of scheduling that ensured my husband Marcus got to his business meetings on time, my daughter Sophia made it to her college classes without missing a beat, and my son Tyler never forgot about basketball practice or academic deadlines. I had built my entire existence around the intricate choreography of their needs, their wants, their schedules, their dreams. For 32 years, I had been the invisible hand that made their lives run smoothly, the background music that they never really heard but would miss if it stopped playing. I was the family coordinator, the emotional manager, the financial planner, the problem solver, and the safety net all rolled into one exhausted 54-year-old woman who had somehow forgotten that she was supposed to have dreams too. That Tuesday morning started like every other. Marcus was rushing around looking for his presentation folder, which I had already placed by his briefcase the night before. Sophia was frantically texting me from her dorm room about a bill that needed to be paid by noon, which I had already scheduled for automatic payment weeks earlier. Tyler was calling from his apartment across town, wondering if I could pick up his dry cleaning, because he had back-to-back meetings with potential sponsors for his photography business. I handled each crisis with the efficiency of a seasoned air traffic controller, moving between phone calls and text messages, while simultaneously preparing Marcus's lunch and transferring money to Sophia's account. This was my life, and I had convinced myself it was a good life because their successes felt like my successes. Their happiness felt like my purpose. The Crawford family had always been the picture of success from the outside. Marcus ran a thriving consulting firm that specialized in helping small businesses expand their operations. Sophia was in her senior year at Northwestern, studying international business with plans to get her MBA immediately after graduation. Tyler had graduated 2 years earlier with a degree in photography and was building a name for himself in commercial photography, shooting everything from wedding portraits to corporate headshots. We lived in a beautiful colonial house in Winnetka, Illinois, complete with the white picket fence and the perfectly manicured lawn that said, "Successful American family" to everyone who drove past. I had spent years perfecting that image, hosting dinner parties where Marcus could network with potential clients, organizing fundraisers for Sophia's sorority, and making sure Tyler had the best equipment for his photography ventures. But success, I was learning, could be a very lonely thing when you're the only one working to maintain it while everyone else just enjoys the benefits. The first crack in my perfectly constructed reality appeared during what should have been a routine family phone call. It was a Sunday evening, and I had initiated our weekly family conference call, something I had established years earlier to keep everyone connected despite busy schedules. Marcus was in his home office, Sophia was calling from her dorm, and Tyler was dialing in from his apartment. "So I was thinking," I said, settling into my favorite chair with a cup of tea, "spring break is coming up, and we haven't taken a real family vacation in over 2 years. What do you all think about planning something special?" There was a pause on the line, the kind of pause that makes your stomach clench even when you don't yet understand why. "Actually, Mom," Sophia's voice came through with a carefully controlled tone. "Tyler and I were just talking about that yesterday." My heart lifted. Maybe they had been thinking the same thing. Maybe this would be easier than I thought. "We've been saving up," Tyler continued, "and we found this amazing deal for a Disney World package. 5 days, 4 nights, staying at the Grand Floridian." "Oh, that sounds wonderful," I said, already mentally calculating costs and thinking about what I would need to pack. "When were you thinking?" Another pause, this one longer. "Well," Sophia said slowly, "the thing is, it's kind of a sibling trip. You know, just me and Tyler, like old times." The words hit me like a physical blow, but I forced my voice to remain steady. "Oh, I see. That sounds nice for you two." "We figured," Tyler added, his voice carrying that casual tone that suggested this decision had been made long before this phone call, "that you and Dad probably wouldn't be that interested anyway. I mean, Disney isn't really your thing, right?" I stared at the phone, wondering when exactly my children had decided they knew what my thing was. When had they determined that I wouldn't want to ride Space Mountain, or eat Dole Whips, or watch the fireworks over Cinderella's castle? When had they concluded that the woman who had taken them to Disney World 6 times when they were children, who had stood in those same lines and bought those same overpriced souvenirs with a smile on her face, would suddenly find no joy in returning to the place that had given us some of our happiest family memories? "What about Dad?" I asked, grasping for something to anchor myself to. "Dad's got that big presentation next week," Marcus called out from his office, clearly having been listening to the conversation. "Besides, you know how I feel about crowds." "So it's settled then," Sophia said with the finality of someone who had never doubted that her decision would be accepted without question. "Tyler and I will go to Disney, and you and Dad can have a nice quiet week at home." After we hung up, I sat in that chair for nearly an hour, staring at the phone and trying to understand what had just happened. My children, the 2 people I had given my entire adult life to raising, supporting, and nurturing, had planned a vacation without me. Not only had they planned it without me, but they had done so with such casual certainty that they couldn't even imagine I might want to be included. The rational part of my mind tried to make excuses for them. They were adults now, building their own lives, and it was natural for them to want experiences that didn't include their parents. The maternal part of my mind reminded me that I should be proud of how independent and close they had become as siblings. But there was another part of my mind, a part that had been quiet for so long I had almost forgotten it existed, that whispered something different. That part whispered that maybe, just maybe, I had become so focused on being what everyone else needed that I had forgotten to be someone they actually wanted around. The next few days passed in a blur of ordinary activities that felt anything but ordinary. I continued my routine, making breakfast for Marcus, coordinating schedules, paying bills, managing the household, but underneath it all was a growing awareness that something fundamental had shifted. I found myself watching my family with new eyes, paying attention to conversations I had previously dismissed as background noise. I noticed that when Marcus talked about his work, he rarely asked for my input anymore, even though I had helped him build his business from the ground up. I noticed that when Sophia called to complain about professors or roommates, she seemed to view me more as a sounding board than someone whose advice she actually valued. I noticed that Tyler's requests for help had become increasingly transactional, less about connecting with me and more about accessing the services I provided. Slowly, painfully, I began to realize that somewhere along the way, I had transformed from a person into a function. I wasn't Ethel Crawford, woman with her own thoughts, dreams, and desires. I was Mom, the person who handled logistics and provided emotional labor and solved problems and asked for very little in return. The revelation hit me fully one evening when I overheard Marcus on a phone call with his brother. "Yeah, Ethel's got everything under control here," he was saying. "She always does. I swear, sometimes I think she could run the Pentagon with the way she organizes our lives." He said it with affection, even pride, but I heard something else in his tone. He was talking about me the way someone might talk about a really efficient personal assistant. Valuable, certainly. Appreciated, absolutely. But not quite. Essential as a person. That night, after Marcus had gone to bed, I did something I hadn't done in years. I went to my computer and started browsing travel websites. Not researching family-friendly destinations or hotels with good conference facilities for Marcus's business trips. I looked at places I wanted to go, experiences I wanted to have, adventures that called to something deep inside me that I had been ignoring for far too long. I found myself clicking through photos of overwater bungalows in Bora Bora, safari lodges in Kenya, cooking classes in Tuscany, and wellness retreats in Costa Rica. Each image felt like a window into a version of myself that I had never allowed to exist. A woman who traveled for pleasure instead of obligation, who made choices based on her own desires instead of everyone else's needs. But it was a small luxury resort in the Bahamas that stopped my scrolling completely. Compass Cay was a private island that offered week-long retreats for small groups, with accommodations that bordered on the extravagant. The website showed crystal clear water, pristine beaches, overwater hammocks, and dining experiences that looked like something out of a magazine. The price tag was breathtaking, nearly $15,000 for a week, but as I stared at those photos, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. I felt desire. Not the practical desire to make someone else happy or solve someone else's problem, but pure, selfish, unapologetic want. I closed the laptop and went to bed, but I couldn't stop thinking about those overwater bungalows and that pristine beach. For the first time in decades, I fell asleep dreaming about something that was entirely, completely mine. The next morning brought the conversation that would change everything. Sophia called during my usual coffee time, her voice bright with excitement. "Mom, guess what? Tyler and I booked the Disney trip. We're going next month, March 15th through 19th. I am so excited I could burst." I felt my chest tighten, but I managed to keep my voice level. Preparing and narrating the story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "That's wonderful, sweetheart. I'm sure you'll have a great time. We're staying at the Grand Floridian, and we got the dining plan, and Tyler found this photographer who specializes in sibling shots, so we're going to get some really beautiful pictures taken. Oh, and we're doing the behind-the-scenes tour at Epcot that you always wanted to do, remember?" The casual mention of the Epcot tour hit me like a slap. I had mentioned wanting to do that tour during our last family trip to Disney World, 8 years earlier, when the kids were still in high school. We had run out of time and money by the last day, and I had said wistfully that maybe we could do it next time. There had never been a next time, but apparently there was now just not one that included me. "That sounds amazing," I said, and I meant it even though it hurt. "How are you paying for all this?" "Well, that's the thing," Sophia said, and I could hear the shift in her tone. "We were hoping maybe you could help us out a little bit. I know it's a lot to ask, but Tyler's business is still getting off the ground, and I've got student loans to think about. We figured since you and Dad aren't going, maybe you could contribute what you would have spent on your own trip." I set down my coffee cup with hands that had started to shake. "You want me to help pay for a vacation that I'm not invited on?" "It's not that you're not invited, Mom," Sophia said quickly. "It's just that this is something Tyler and I really want to do together. You know, sibling bonding time. But we thought since family vacations are always something you plan and budget for anyway, this could be like your gift to us." I stared out the kitchen window at the bird feeder I had filled that morning, watching cardinals and blue jays compete for seeds. The metaphor wasn't lost on me. "How much are you asking for?" I said finally. "Well, the total cost is about $6,000, so maybe if you could cover half." $3,000? It would mean the world to us, Mom. $3,000. The amount of money I typically spent on a nice family vacation for all 4 of us. The amount they wanted me to contribute so they could take a vacation without me. "Let me think about it," I said. "Oh, thank you, Mom. I knew you'd understand. You're the best." After she hung up, I sat at that kitchen table for a long time, staring at my cold coffee and feeling something crystallize inside me. It wasn't anger exactly, though anger was certainly part of it. It was more like clarity, the kind of sudden understanding that comes when you finally see a situation for what it really is, instead of what you've been pretending it is. My family didn't want me on their vacation. But they did want my money. They didn't value my presence, but they valued my function as a financial resource. They didn't see me as someone whose company they enjoyed, but they saw me as someone whose generosity they could count on. And the most painful part was that I had trained them to see me this way. For years, I had prioritized their happiness over my own, their dreams over my own, their needs over my own. I had been so afraid of being seen as selfish or demanding that I had taught them to see me as infinitely giving and infinitely available. I had made myself invisible, and now they couldn't see me even when they were looking right at me. That afternoon, I did two things that surprised even me. First, I called my financial advisor and asked for a complete breakdown of our savings, investments, and discretionary income. Second, I opened my laptop and went back to that Compass K website. The resort had an opening for the exact same week Sophia and Tyler would be at Disney World, March 15th through 19th. It was as if the universe was presenting me with a choice, a moment where I could decide who I wanted to be moving forward. I could be the woman who funded other people's dreams while forgetting her own. Or I could be the woman who finally, after 54 years on this planet, put herself first. I stared at the Book Now button for what felt like hours, my cursor hovering over it like a hummingbird that couldn't decide whether to land. This wasn't just about a vacation. This was about fundamentally changing the dynamic of relationships that had defined my adult life. This was about saying, for the first time in decades, that my desires mattered as much as anyone else's. When Marcus came home that evening, I was sitting at the kitchen table with papers spread out in front of me, financial statements, travel brochures, and a printed email confirmation that I hadn't sent yet. "What's all this?" he asked, kissing the top of my head in the absent way that had become his standard greeting. "I'm planning a trip," I said simply. He glanced at the papers more closely, and I saw his eyebrows raise when he spotted the Compass K brochure. "This looks expensive, Ethel. What's the occasion?" "Sophia called today asking for $3,000 to help pay for the Disney trip she and Tyler are taking without us." Marcus nodded, already reaching for his phone to check messages. "That's nice of you to help them out." "I'm not giving them the money." That got his attention. He looked up from his phone, confusion written across his face. "What do you mean?" "I mean I'm not paying for a vacation I'm not invited on. Instead, I'm using that money to take my own vacation." Marcus sat down across from me, and I could see him trying to process this information. In our 32 years of marriage, I had never taken a trip by myself. I had never spent a significant amount of money on something that was purely for my own enjoyment. I had never prioritized my own desires over family obligations. "Ethel," he said carefully, "this seems a bit extreme. The kids just want to have some sibling time." "There's nothing wrong with that." "You're right," I said. "There's nothing wrong with them wanting sibling time, but there's also nothing wrong with me wanting to take a vacation somewhere I've always dreamed of going." "But $15,000, Ethel, that's a lot of money." I looked at him steadily. "It's less than what we've spent on Tyler's photography equipment over the past 2 years. It's less than what we contributed to Sophia's sorority dues and social activities. It's certainly less than what we've invested in your business networking events and conferences." Marcus was quiet for a moment, and I could see him trying to find an argument that didn't sound hypocritical. "This just doesn't seem like you," he said finally. "Maybe that's the problem," I replied. That night, I lay in bed listening to Marcus breathe beside me and thinking about the version of myself that had been emerging over the past few weeks. She was someone I barely recognized, this woman who was willing to disappoint people in order to pursue her own happiness. She was someone who said no to requests that diminished her worth. She was someone who believed she deserved beautiful things, extraordinary experiences, and the kind of luxury that she had spent decades providing for others. I liked her. I liked her a lot. The next morning, I sent the confirmation email for my reservation at Compass K. Then I called Sophia. "Mom, have you thought about what we discussed yesterday?" she asked before I could even say hello. "I have," I said. And I've decided not to contribute to your Disney trip. Silence. Then, what do you mean? I mean, I'm going to be taking my own vacation that week, so I won't be able to help financially. Your own vacation? Where? A private island in the Bahamas. Another silence, longer this time. Mom, are you feeling okay? This doesn't sound like you at all. There it was again. This doesn't sound like you. As if the only acceptable version of me was the one who existed to facilitate other people's experiences while having none of her own. I'm feeling fine, Sophia. I'm feeling like it's time I did something purely for myself. But Mom, we've been planning this for weeks. We've already booked everything. Then I suggest you figure out how to pay for it. Are you seriously going to ruin our vacation because you're having some kind of midlife crisis? The accusation stung, but it also clarified something for me. In Sophia's mind, my refusal to fund her vacation was ruining it. Not planning it without me. Not asking me to pay for something I wasn't invited to. My failure to give her what she wanted was the problem. I'm not ruining anything, sweetheart. I'm just finally doing something for myself. This is so selfish, Mom. This isn't who you are. Maybe it's exactly who I am, I said quietly. Maybe I just forgot for a while. After I hung up, I felt a mixture of sadness and liberation that I wasn't quite prepared for. I was sad that my daughter couldn't understand why I might want to prioritize my own happiness for once. But I was liberated by the realization that her inability to understand didn't change the validity of my choice. Over the next few days, the family reaction was swift and predictable. Tyler called to express his disappointment, his tone suggesting that I was being unreasonable and hurtful. Marcus grew increasingly quiet around the house, treating me with the careful politeness usually reserved for someone who was acting irrationally. Sophia sent me a series of texts that ranged from pleading to accusatory. But none of it changed my mind. If anything, their reactions confirmed that I had made the right choice. For the first time in my adult life, I was prioritizing my own needs, and the people who claimed to love me most were reacting as if I had committed some kind of betrayal. 2 weeks before my departure date, I was sitting on my back porch with a cup of coffee and my travel itinerary when my phone rang. It was my sister Margaret, who lived in Portland and had always been the voice of reason in our family. Ethel, she said without preamble, Marcus called me. He says you're having some kind of breakdown. I laughed, surprising myself with how genuinely amused I felt. Is that what he's calling it? He says you're spending $15,000 on a vacation to spite the kids for not inviting you to Disney World. Well, he's half right. I am spending $15,000 on a vacation. But it's not to spite anyone. It's because I want to. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Ethel, you've never done anything like this before. Exactly. What do you mean exactly? I took a sip of my coffee and looked out at the garden I had planted and maintained for 20 years, every flower chosen with someone else's preferences in mind. I mean that maybe it's time I started doing things I've never done before. Maybe it's time I remembered that I'm a person with my own desires and dreams, not just a support system for everyone else's. But the kids are adults, Margaret. They're perfectly capable of funding their own vacation. They just don't want to, because they know I've always been willing to do it for them. And Marcus? Marcus will survive a week without me managing his schedule and making his meals. It might even be good for him. Margaret sighed. I'm worried about you, Ethel. This seems so out of character. Maybe that's the point, I said softly. Maybe being in character has been the problem all along. We talked for another hour, and by the end of the conversation, I could hear something different in Margaret's voice. Not approval, exactly, but a kind of grudging understanding. You know what? She said as we were saying goodbye. Maybe I'm a little jealous. I can't remember the last time I did something purely for myself. It's never too late, I told her. After we hung up, I sat on that porch for a long time, thinking about the conversation and about the woman I had been versus the woman I was becoming. The old Ethel would have been devastated by her family's disappointment. She would have apologized, canceled the trip, and written the check for Disney World, while convincing herself that their happiness was more important than her own. But this new Ethel, the one who was emerging from decades of self-neglect, understood something the old one never had. Love shouldn't require you to make yourself smaller. Support shouldn't mean sacrificing your own dreams for someone else's convenience. Being a good mother and wife didn't mean being an invisible one. As I sat there in the fading afternoon light, I realized that I wasn't having a breakdown. I was having a breakthrough. For the first time in my adult life, I was choosing myself, and it felt like coming home to someone I had been waiting my whole life to meet. My flight to Nassau was scheduled for March 14th, one day before Sophia and Tyler's departure for Orlando. As the date approached, the temperature in my house seemed to drop by several degrees. Marcus spoke to me with the careful politeness of someone navigating around a person who had become unpredictable. The kids' phone calls became less frequent and more stilted, as if they were afraid that any conversation might turn into another discussion about my selfish decision. But I felt lighter with each passing day. I had gotten my hair done for the first time in 2 years. Not just trimmed, but actually styled by someone who understood that a 54-year-old woman could still want to feel beautiful. I had bought new clothes for the trip, flowing sundresses and comfortable sandals, and a swimsuit that actually fit properly instead of the practical one-piece I had been wearing for the past decade. Most importantly, I had started planning activities for my week away. Not logistics for other people, but experiences I wanted to have. I had booked a sunset sail, a cooking class with the resort's chef, a spa day that included treatments I couldn't even pronounce, and several excursions to explore the surrounding islands. For the first time in decades, I was thinking about a vacation in terms of what I wanted to do rather than what would make everyone else happy. The night before my departure, Marcus finally broke his careful silence. "I still don't understand why you're doing this," he said as I finished packing my suitcase. I looked at him sitting on the edge of our bed, this man I had loved and supported and prioritized for over 3 decades, and felt a wave of sadness for how far apart we had grown without either of us noticing. "Marcus," I said gently, "when was the last time you asked me what I wanted? Not what I thought was best for the family, not what would work with everyone else's schedule, but what I actually wanted for myself?" He was quiet for a long moment, and I could see him searching his memory. "I don't know," he said finally. "Neither do I. And that's why I'm doing this." I zipped up my suitcase and set it by the bedroom door, then sat down beside him on the bed. "I love our family," I said. "I love you, and I love the kids, and I'm proud of everything we've built together. But somewhere along the way, I stopped being a person and became a function. I became the woman who handles things, who makes sacrifices, who says yes to everything and asks for nothing in return." Marcus looked uncomfortable, shifting on the bed and avoiding my eyes. "That's not true," he said. "We appreciate everything you do. I know you do, but appreciation isn't the same as seeing me as a whole person with my own needs and desires. When was the last time any of you were interested in something I wanted to do? When was the last time someone asked about my dreams instead of my availability to help with theirs?" He didn't have an answer because there wasn't one. "This trip isn't about punishing anyone," I continued. "It's about remembering who I am outside of being your wife and their mother. It's about proving to myself that I'm worth more than just the services I provide." That night I barely slept, but it wasn't from anxiety. It was from excitement. Pure, childlike excitement about the adventure that awaited me. I felt like a teenager sneaking out of the house. Except I was 54 years old, and sneaking into my own life. The next morning, Marcus drove me to the airport in a silence that felt heavy with things neither of us quite knew how to say. As he pulled up to the departure curb, he finally spoke. "Ethel, I hope you know that we do love you." I leaned over and kissed his cheek, tasting the familiar scent of his aftershave and feeling a complicated mixture of love and pity. "I know you do," I said, "but I'm hoping that when I come back you'll remember how to show it in ways that don't require me to disappear." As my plane lifted off from O'Hare, I pressed my face to the window and watched Chicago shrink below me. With each mile of distance, I felt something loosening in my chest, as if I had been holding my breath for years and could finally exhale. I was flying towards something I had never allowed myself to have. A week that belonged entirely to me. A week where every decision would be based on my own desires, Every moment would be lived for my own pleasure. Every experience would be chosen, because it brought me joy. For the first time in my adult life, I was traveling not as someone's wife or someone's mother, but as Ethel Crawford, a woman who was finally ready to discover what she had been missing all along. The plane banked toward the south, carrying me away from a life of service and toward a week of pure, unapologetic selfishness. And as the coastline of Florida appeared below us, I smiled to myself and thought about the photos I would soon be posting, the memories I would soon be making, and the woman I was finally allowing myself to become. They had left me behind, but I was no longer following anyway. I was flying toward my own horizon, and it was more beautiful than anything I had ever imagined. The flight to Nassau felt like crossing into another dimension, one where Ethel Crawford was allowed to exist as more than just a facilitator of other people's experiences. As the plane descended through cotton ball clouds toward the brilliant blue expanse of the Caribbean, I found myself pressing my palms against the small window like a child seeing snow for the first time. Below me stretched an endless canvas of turquoise and sapphire, dotted with islands that looked like emeralds scattered across silk. I had flown many times before, of course, but always with purpose that belonged to someone else. Business trips where I accompanied Marcus to networking conferences, family vacations where my attention was divided between making sure everyone had their passports and managing the inevitable meltdowns that came with coordinating multiple schedules and preferences. This was different. This flight belonged entirely to me, carrying me toward a week where the only person I needed to please was myself. The woman sitting next to me, an elegant silver-haired lady reading a mystery novel, glanced over as I fumbled with my phone to capture the view. "First time to the Bahamas?" she asked with a knowing smile. "First time anywhere by myself," I admitted, then immediately felt embarrassed by the confession. At 54, shouldn't I have figured out how to travel solo decades ago? But she didn't look surprised or judgmental. Instead, her smile widened. How wonderfully liberating that must feel. "I'm Margaret Sinclair, and I've been taking solo trips for 15 years, ever since my husband passed. There's nothing quite like the freedom of answering to no one but yourself." We spent the remainder of the flight talking about travel, about the joy of eating dinner at whatever time you choose, of changing plans without consulting anyone, of spending an entire day reading on a beach without feeling guilty about being unproductive. Margaret had visited Compass Cay twice before and regaled me with stories of swimming with nurse sharks, dining on freshly caught lobster while watching the sunset, and sleeping in until noon simply because she could. "The staff there understands luxury in a way that goes beyond thread counts and champagne service," she said as we began our descent. "They understand that true luxury is the permission to be completely, authentically yourself." As we disembarked in Nassau, Margaret pressed a business card into my hand. "Call me when you get back to Chicago," she said. "I have a feeling you're going to need someone to talk to who understands what it's like to discover yourself after decades of being invisible." The short connecting flight to Compass Cay was aboard a small seaplane that skimmed just above the water, offering views that belonged in a travel magazine. The pilot, a cheerful Bahamian man named Samuel, pointed out various islands and shared stories about the local wildlife, the best snorkeling spots, and the legendary rum punches served at the resort. As we approached Compass Cay, I could see the overwater bungalows that had captured my imagination weeks earlier, connected by wooden walkways that stretched out over the crystal-clear lagoon like fingers reaching toward the horizon. The resort's welcome was unlike anything I had ever experienced. As the seaplane touched down at the private dock, I was greeted by name by a woman named Celeste, the guest relations manager, who handed me a chilled towel and a glass of champagne, while porters whisked my luggage away with efficiency that seemed almost magical. "Welcome to Compass Cay, Mrs. Crawford," Celeste said in the musical accent that made even ordinary words sound like poetry. "We are so honored to have you with us this week. Your bungalow is ready, and we've prepared a special welcome amenity since this is your first visit to our little slice of paradise." My bungalow was everything the photographs had promised and more. Built on stilts over the lagoon, it featured floor-to-ceiling windows that offered 360-degree views of the water. The bed was positioned so that I could lie down and watch tropical fish swimming beneath the glass floor panels. A private deck extended from the main room, complete with a hammock, outdoor shower, and steps that led directly down into the lagoon. But it was the silence that took my breath away. Not the oppressive silence of an empty house where everyone had forgotten to include you, but the peaceful silence of a place where the only sounds were waves lapping against the bungalow supports and the distant calls of seabirds. For the first time in decades, there were no schedules to coordinate, no phone calls to answer, no one else's needs to anticipate and manage. I unpacked slowly, hanging my new sundresses in the walk-in closet and arranging my toiletries in the marble bathroom that was larger than some hotel rooms I had stayed in with my family. The welcome amenity Celeste had mentioned turned out to be a handwritten note from the resort chef, offering to prepare any meals that accommodated my dietary preferences, along with a bottle of champagne from a vintage I had never heard of, but which tasted like liquid starlight. That first evening, I dined alone on my private deck while watching the sun paint the sky in shades of orange and pink that seemed too vivid to be real. The meal had been prepared specifically for me by Chef Antoine, a consultation that had involved 20 minutes of discussion about flavor preferences, dietary restrictions, and the simple question of what would make me happiest. The result was a feast of local seafood, tropical fruits and vegetables I couldn't identify, but which tasted like they had been picked moments before serving. As I savored each bite and watched the sky deepen from coral to purple to indigo, I realized that I couldn't remember the last time I had eaten a meal that was prepared entirely for my enjoyment. At home, dinner was always about balancing everyone's preferences, accommodating Marcus's business schedule, making sure there were options that Sophia and Tyler would eat when they visited. Even when I cooked my favorite foods, I was always conscious of whether others would enjoy them, always ready to adjust seasonings or side dishes to please the family palate. This meal was mine. Chosen for me, prepared for me, served to me without consideration for anyone else's preferences or schedule. It was such a simple pleasure, yet it felt revolutionary. After dinner, I called Marcus to let him know I had arrived safely. He answered on the fourth ring, his voice distracted. "Oh, Ethel, good. How was the flight?" "Beautiful. The resort is incredible, Marcus. I'm sitting on a deck that extends out over a lagoon, and I can see tropical fish swimming underneath the floor." "That's nice. Listen, I can't find the insurance paperwork for the house. Do you remember where you filed it?" I closed my eyes and felt something familiar rise in my chest. Even from 1,500 miles away, even during a conversation about my exotic vacation, the focus had immediately shifted to what I could do for him. "It's in the filing cabinet in your office, in the folder marked Property Insurance 2024, I said automatically. "Great, thanks." "Oh, and Tyler called looking for the contact information for that client you helped him land last year. I told him I'd ask you for it." "Marcus," I said slowly, "I'm on vacation." I know. I just figured you might have the information handy." "I'm sitting on a private deck in the Bahamas, drinking champagne and watching the sunset. I don't have client contact information handy." There was a pause, and I could almost hear him trying to process the idea that I might not be available to provide immediate assistance with random requests. "Right, of course." "Well, enjoy your dinner." After we hung up, I sat in the gathering darkness and felt the familiar weight of family obligation trying to settle back onto my shoulders. The old Ethel would have immediately called Tyler with the contact information, would have made a mental note to reorganize the filing system when she got home, would have spent the rest of the evening checking her phone in case anyone else needed something. Instead, I turned off my phone and poured myself another glass of champagne. The next morning, I woke naturally as sunlight streamed through the windows of my overwater bungalow, with no alarm clock and no immediate obligations. The sensation was so foreign that for a moment I felt disoriented, my body conditioned after decades to wake up with a mental checklist already forming. But gradually, as I remembered where I was and why I was there, a sense of peaceful possibility settled over me like a warm blanket. I had breakfast delivered to my deck, a selection of tropical fruits, fresh pastries, and coffee that tasted like it had been grown on the island itself. As I ate, I watched a small reef shark glide gracefully beneath my bungalow, its movements hypnotic in the clear water. At home, I would have been rushing through breakfast while checking emails and planning the day's logistics. Here, I could take as long as I wanted, could sit in my silk pajamas and watch marine life, while considering what kind of adventure I felt like having. My first excursion was a snorkeling trip to a nearby coral reef, something I had always wanted to do but had never prioritized during family vacations that focused on activities everyone could enjoy together. Our guide, a young Bahamian woman named Coral, led a group of 6 guests to a reef system that looked like an underwater garden, populated with fish in colors I hadn't known existed in nature. Floating above that reef, breathing through a snorkel and watching tropical fish dart between brain coral and sea fans, I felt a sense of wonder that I had forgotten was possible. This was exploration for the pure joy of discovery, adventure undertaken simply because it called to something deep inside me. No one was depending on me to navigate, to keep track of equipment, to manage logistics or mediate preferences. I could simply exist in the moment, mesmerized by the alien beauty of this underwater world. After lunch, I had my first spa appointment, a massage that took place in an open-air pavilion overlooking the ocean. The therapist, a serene woman named Luna, worked out knots in my shoulders and back that I hadn't even realized were there, tension that had accumulated from years of carrying the weight of everyone else's problems. "You hold stress in your upper back," Luna observed as she worked. "This is common in women who take care of many people. Your body remembers every burden you have carried for others." As her hands worked to release muscles that had been tight for years, I felt emotions bubbling up that I hadn't expected. Not sadness exactly, but a kind of grief for the woman I had been, always tense, always ready to spring into action to solve someone else's problem. Luna worked in silence, intuitive enough to understand that this was about more than physical tension. When the massage ended, I felt lighter than I had in years, as if I had literally been carrying a weight that had finally been lifted. I spent the afternoon in a hammock on my deck, reading a novel I had chosen purely for pleasure, not because it was on a book club list or because it would provide conversation topics for dinner parties. Just a simple romance novel with a happy ending, the kind of book I had once loved but had stopped reading because it seemed frivolous compared to the biographies and business books that lined our shelves at home. That evening, I joined other resort guests for dinner at the main restaurant, something I had been nervous about but which turned out to be effortlessly pleasant. I was seated at a table with Margaret Sinclair, the woman from my flight, and 2 other solo travelers, David, a recently retired professor from Vancouver, and Elena, a businesswoman from London who was celebrating a major career achievement. The conversation flowed easily, covering travel experiences, favorite books, career adventures, and life philosophies. What struck me most was how naturally I participated, offering opinions and sharing stories without the constant internal editing that had become second nature in my interactions at home. I wasn't monitoring the conversation to make sure everyone else was comfortable, wasn't deflecting attention from myself to focus on others' interests. I was simply present as myself, and these strangers seemed genuinely interested in what I had to say. "It's remarkable," Elena observed over dessert, "how different we can become when we step outside our usual roles. I'm a completely different person when I travel alone than when I'm managing my team at work." "I was just thinking the same thing," I said. "At home, I'm constantly in problem-solving mode, anticipating what everyone else needs. Here, I'm remembering what it feels like to just be myself." David raised his wine glass. "To the luxury of being exactly who we are, without apology or explanation." We all clinked glasses, and I felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the wine. These people barely knew me, yet they were celebrating the authentic version of myself that I was just beginning to rediscover. After dinner, I took a long walk along the beach, my feet sinking into sand that was still warm from the day's sun. The moon was nearly full, casting a silver path across the water that seemed to lead toward infinite possibilities. I thought about my family, probably settling into their hotel at Disney World, and felt something I hadn't expected: genuine happiness for them, uncomplicated by resentment or hurt feelings. They were having their adventure, and I was having mine. For the first time, it felt like an even exchange rather than a rejection. The third day brought a cooking class with Chef Antoine, an experience that epitomized everything I was discovering about the difference between service and pleasure. At home, cooking was a daily obligation, a task to be completed efficiently while juggling other responsibilities. I planned meals around everyone else's preferences, shopped with budget constraints and dietary restrictions in mind, and prepared food as quickly as possible so I could move on to the next item on my endless to-do list. This cooking class was pure joy. Chef Antoine and I spent the morning at the local market, selecting ingredients based on freshness, beauty, and the simple question of what would create the most delicious combination of flavors. We chose fish that had been caught that morning, vegetables that still had dirt on them, herbs that perfumed the air when we crushed their leaves between our fingers. Back in the resort's teaching kitchen, Chef Antoine guided me through techniques I had never learned. Patience and creativity replacing the rush and practicality that characterized my cooking at home. We prepared a meal that took 4 hours to create, every step an exploration of flavor and texture and presentation. The result was a work of art that we ate slowly, savoring each bite while discussing the way different ingredients complemented and enhanced each other. Cooking with joy creates different flavors than cooking with obligation, Chef Antoine told me as we shared our creation. The food knows the difference, and so do the people who eat it. That afternoon, I had perhaps my most transformative experience of the trip, a sailing lesson on a small catamaran. I had always loved the water but had never learned to sail, despite living near Lake Michigan for decades. Family beach vacations had always focused on activities that everyone could enjoy together, and sailing lessons for one person had never seemed like a priority worth pursuing. Captain James, a weathered man whose hands moved over the rigging with the confidence of decades of experience, taught me to read the wind, to adjust the sails, to feel the boat respond to my touch on the tiller. Within an hour, I was sailing independently around the protected lagoon, the wind filling the sail and pushing us forward with a power that felt both ancient and exhilarating. "You're a natural," Captain James called from the dock as I completed my third solo circuit of the lagoon. "Some people fight the wind, try to force the boat to do what they want. You're learning to work with it, to let it teach you." As I sailed that small catamaran around the crystal-clear lagoon, I understood what he meant. This wasn't about conquering or controlling, but about partnership, about learning to read the signs and respond with intuition rather than force. It was a metaphor that extended far beyond sailing, a lesson about the difference between fighting against life and learning to move with it gracefully. That evening, I called Sophia, curious about how their Disney vacation was progressing. She answered while waiting in line for Space Mountain, her voice bright with excitement. "Mom, this place is incredible. We're having the best time. Tyler got us fast passes for all the good rides, and we've already done the Haunted Mansion 3 times. And the food is so good, we've been eating our way through Epcot all day." I listened to her describe their adventures, and to my surprise, I felt genuinely happy for them. The hurt and resentment that had driven my initial decision to take this solo trip had been replaced by something more peaceful. They were having exactly the vacation they had wanted, and so was I. "That sounds wonderful, sweetheart. I'm so glad you're enjoying yourselves. What about you? How's your fancy resort?" I looked out at the moonlight, reflecting off the lagoon, at the gentle lights of my overwater bungalow, at the dinner table where I had just shared a meal with interesting people who had become fast friends. "It's perfect," I said simply. "Good. You deserve a nice vacation, Mom. I'm sorry we didn't think to invite you to Disney. I guess we just assumed you wouldn't be interested." There was something in her tone that suggested the beginning of understanding, a recognition that perhaps they had made assumptions about my desires without actually asking what I wanted. "I probably wouldn't have been interested in the same kind of Disney trip you and Tyler wanted," I said honestly. "But it would have been nice to be asked." "Yeah, I can see that now. Maybe next time we could plan something we'd all enjoy." After we hung up, I sat on my deck with a glass of wine and felt something settling inside me. This wasn't about winning or proving a point. It was about rediscovering my own capacity for joy, my own worthiness of beautiful experiences, my own right to prioritize my happiness. The 4th day brought an adventure that would have been impossible during a family vacation. A solo hike through the island's interior, guided by a naturalist named Marcus who shared his deep knowledge of the local ecosystem. We walked for hours through forests where hummingbirds flashed like jewels among flowering vines, where iguanas sunned themselves on ancient rocks, where the air itself seemed to shimmer with life. Marcus taught me to identify bird calls, to spot the subtle signs that indicated fresh water, to understand the complex relationships between the various plants and animals that made this small island their home. It was education for the pure joy of learning, exploration undertaken simply because the world was full of wonders I had never taken time to notice. Most people rush through nature, Marcus observed as we paused to watch a rare Bahama parrot feeding in a fig tree. They want to see everything quickly, to check experiences off a list. But the real magic happens when you slow down. When you give yourself permission to be amazed by things you might have walked past without noticing. That afternoon, I treated myself to another spa experience. This one, a body wrap made from local sea salt and algae that left my skin feeling like silk. But more than the physical pampering, I treasured the hour of complete stillness, the permission to lie quietly and think about nothing more pressing than how good it felt to be taken care of. The spa therapist, a wise woman named Sage, seemed to understand that this experience represented more than simple indulgence. Self-care is not selfish, she said as she applied the mineral-rich wrap. It is essential. You cannot pour from an empty vessel, and you cannot love others fully until you learn to love yourself with the same dedication. As the treatment worked its magic, I thought about the years I had spent believing that self-sacrifice was the highest form of love, that putting everyone else's needs before my own was the mark of a good mother and wife. But lying there in that peaceful treatment room, I began to understand that perhaps the opposite was true. Perhaps learning to value myself, to prioritize my own well-being, would actually make me more capable of loving others in healthy, sustainable ways. That evening, the resort hosted a beach barbecue with live music performed by local musicians. I danced barefoot in the sand to calypso rhythms, laughing with my fellow guests and feeling more alive than I had in years. David, the retired professor, turned out to be an excellent dancer who taught me steps I had never learned, while Elena and Margaret cheered us on from chairs positioned around a bonfire that painted everyone's faces in warm, golden light. "You're glowing," Margaret observed as I collapsed breathlessly into a chair beside her, accepting a rum punch that tasted like liquid vacation. "I feel like I'm glowing," I admitted. "I feel like I'm becoming someone I always had the potential to be but never gave myself permission to become." "That's the real magic of solo travel," Elena said, raising her glass in a toast. "It strips away all the roles and expectations and reveals who you actually are underneath all of that." As the evening wound down and the musicians packed away their instruments, I walked slowly back to my bungalow, my feet still sandy from dancing, my heart still light from an evening of pure fun. The old Ethel would have spent such an evening making sure everyone else was having a good time, monitoring conversations to ensure no one felt left out, cleaning up after others, and managing logistics. This new Ethel had simply shown up and enjoyed herself, contributing to the collective joy without feeling responsible for orchestrating it. My phone buzzed with a text from Tyler. "Hope you're having a good time, Mom. Wish we could see some photos of your fancy resort." I smiled and spent a few minutes selecting pictures to send. The view from my overwater bungalow, the sunset from my private deck, a selfie of me with my snorkeling gear and a genuine smile that reflected pure happiness. Within minutes, my phone was buzzing with responses from both kids, expressing amazement at the beauty of my surroundings and what sounded like genuine happiness for my experience. But it was Marcus's response that surprised me most. "You look beautiful, Ethel. Happy. I can't remember the last time I saw that expression on your face." I stared at that message for a long time, feeling a complex mixture of sadness and hope. Sadness that it had taken a solo vacation in paradise for my husband to notice that I hadn't been truly happy in years. Hope that perhaps this week away would create space for both of us to remember who we had been before we became so focused on maintaining the machinery of family life that we forgot to nurture our actual relationship. The fifth day dawned cloudy and breezy, perfect weather for the deep-sea fishing expedition I had booked. I had never been fishing before, another activity that had never made it onto our family vacation itineraries because it wasn't something everyone would enjoy. But I had been drawn to the idea of spending hours on the open ocean, learning a skill that required patience and intuition, rather than multitasking and efficiency. Captain Rodriguez, a third-generation fisherman whose family had worked these waters for decades, taught me to read the ocean, to understand how wind and current and the behavior of seabirds could indicate where fish might be feeding. We spent 4 hours on his boat, during which I caught 2 snappers and a small grouper, but more importantly, I learned to appreciate the meditative quality of fishing, the way it demanded complete presence in the moment. The fish teach you patience, Captain Rodriguez explained as we cleaned our catch. They teach you that some things cannot be rushed, cannot be forced. You can only create the right conditions and then wait with faith. That afternoon, I prepared my catch with Chef Antoine, learning to fillet the fish properly and season it with local spices that complemented rather than masked its delicate flavor. We grilled it simply and served it with rice and beans and vegetables from the resort's garden, a meal that connected me directly to the island and the ocean in a way that no restaurant experience ever could. As I ate fish I had caught myself, prepared with my own hands, I thought about the profound satisfaction that came from this kind of direct engagement with my own sustenance. At home, meals were often quick affairs between other obligations, food chosen for convenience and speed rather than connection and nourishment. This meal was different. It represented time invested, skills learned, experiences embraced for their own sake, rather than for their efficiency. That evening, I had dinner with a couple from Germany who were celebrating their 30th wedding anniversary. Hans and Greta had been traveling together for decades, but they spoke with enthusiasm about the solo trips each of them took every year, adventures they pursued individually that enriched their shared life. "People think it is strange," Greta explained over wine that paired perfectly with the evening's seafood special. "They ask why we do not always travel together. But we have learned that coming back together after time apart makes us appreciate each other more. We have new stories to share, new perspectives to bring to our relationship." Hans nodded enthusiastically. When Greta returns from her painting retreats in Tuscany, she brings home a happiness that reminds me why I fell in love with her. When I come back from my hiking trips in the Alps, I see our life together with fresh eyes. Their words sparked something in me, a realization that perhaps the strength of a relationship wasn't measured by how much time you spent together, but by how much joy and growth each person brought to the partnership. I thought about Marcus and our decades together, how we had become so focused on coordinating our lives that we had stopped enriching each other's experiences. After dinner, I called him. But instead of our usual exchange of logistics and status updates, I told him about my fishing expedition, about the satisfaction of catching and preparing my own meal, about the way the ocean had looked at sunset with dolphins playing in our wake. "You sound different," he said when I finished describing my day. "Different? How?" "Excited, engaged. Like you're having adventures instead of just managing logistics." "I am having adventures. And Marcus, I think I've forgotten how to have adventures at home." "I think we both have." There was a long pause, and when he spoke again, his voice was thoughtful in a way it hadn't been in years. "Maybe when you come home, we could figure out how to change that." It was the first conversation we had had in months that felt like it was between two people who genuinely liked each other, rather than two people coordinating the business of shared life. And for the first time since I had booked this trip, I found myself actually looking forward to going home. Not because I missed my old life, but because I was curious about what kind of life I might build with this new understanding of myself. The 6th day brought my most challenging adventure yet. A rock climbing excursion on the island's limestone cliffs. I had never done anything remotely like rock climbing, but something about the physical and mental challenge appealed to the woman I was discovering myself to be. Our guide, an athletic young woman named Storm, fitted me with a harness and helmet and taught me the basics of reading the rock, finding handholds, trusting my equipment, and my own strength. The first route was relatively easy, more of a steep walk than actual climbing, but even that small accomplishment filled me with a sense of pride I hadn't experienced in years. With each route, Storm encouraged me to attempt something slightly more challenging, teaching me to push past the voice in my head that said I was too old, too inexperienced, too risk-averse for such adventures. "Fear is just information," Storm told me as I hesitated at the base of a route that looked impossibly vertical. "It's telling you to pay attention, to be careful, but it doesn't have to stop you. The question isn't whether you're afraid, but whether you trust yourself to handle whatever comes next." I made it halfway up that route before my arms gave out and I had to rappel down, but even that partial success felt like a victory. I had attempted something that 6 months earlier would have seemed completely outside the realm of possibility for Ethel Crawford, suburban wife and mother. I had trusted my own strength, relied on my own judgment, pushed myself beyond my comfort zone, simply because the challenge called to something in me that had been dormant for too long. That afternoon, as I soaked my sore muscles in the outdoor bathtub on my deck, I reflected on how much I had changed in just 6 days. The woman who had arrived at this resort had been someone who defined herself entirely through her relationships to others, who measured her worth by her usefulness, who had forgotten that she was a person with her own desires and capabilities. This woman, the one soaking in a tub overlooking a lagoon where tropical fish swam beneath her overwater bungalow, was someone I was still getting to know. She was brave enough to try new things, confident enough to dine alone, adventurous enough to climb rocks and sail boats and swim with sharks. She was someone who could appreciate luxury without guilt, who could prioritize her own pleasure without apology, who could exist fully in the moment without constantly managing everyone else's experience. I thought about the photo Sophia and Tyler had posted from Disney World the day before, showing them grinning in front of the Millennium Falcon at Galaxy's Edge. They looked happy, genuinely happy, in a way that suggested they were having exactly the vacation they had wanted. And I was having exactly the vacation I had wanted too. For the first time in our family's history, everyone had gotten what they actually desired instead of compromising to accommodate the lowest common denominator. That evening's dinner was a private affair on my deck, prepared by Chef Antoine as a farewell feast. He had created a menu that incorporated all of my favorite discoveries from the week: the local fish I had learned to catch and prepare, tropical fruits I had never tasted before, vegetables grown in the resort's garden that I had helped harvest during my cooking class. As I savored each course while watching the sun set over the Caribbean, I felt a deep sense of gratitude, not just for the experiences I had enjoyed, but for the woman I had rediscovered. This week hadn't been about escaping my life so much as remembering that I was someone worth investing in, someone whose happiness mattered, someone who deserved beautiful experiences and new adventures and moments of pure joy. My phone buzzed with a text from Margaret, the woman from my flight who was staying at a resort on a neighboring island. "I hope this week has been as transformative for you as it looks like it's been. You've inspired me to book a solo trip to Morocco next month." I smiled and typed back, "It's been life-changing, and Morocco sounds incredible. I think I'm going to start planning my next solo adventure before I even get home." As I sent that message, I realized that was exactly what I intended to do. This week in paradise hadn't been a one-time escape from my regular life. It had been an awakening to the kind of life I wanted to create moving forward, one where I was the protagonist of my own story rather than a supporting character in everyone else's. My last morning at Compass K arrived with the kind of perfect sunrise that makes you believe the universe has been saving its best work for exactly this moment. I woke without an alarm in my overwater bungalow, the gentle sounds of waves beneath my floor and seabirds calling across the lagoon creating nature's own symphony. For a moment I lay still in the Egyptian cotton sheets, watching tropical fish swim lazily beneath the glass panels, and marveled at how completely I had adapted to this rhythm of waking naturally, moving slowly, responding to my body's needs rather than external demands. The woman who had arrived here 7 days ago would have been frantically packing, checking departure times, coordinating transportation, and managing the anxiety of re-entry into her regular life. This woman, the one I had become or perhaps rediscovered, was savoring these final hours, treating them as precious rather than stressful. I had learned to inhabit time differently here, to let moments expand and breathe instead of rushing through them toward the next obligation. I prepared for my departure with the same deliberate pleasure I had brought to every other activity this week. Instead of throwing clothes haphazardly into my suitcase, I folded each sundress carefully, remembering the meals where I had worn it, the adventures it had accompanied, the conversations it had witnessed, the flowing blue dress that had carried me through my first dinner with new friends, the coral-colored sundress I had worn while learning to sail, the white linen pants that had gotten sandy during the beach barbecue where I had danced until my feet hurt and my heart soared. Each piece of clothing had become associated with a version of myself that I was determined not to leave behind on this island. The woman who had worn these outfits was confident, adventurous, worthy of beautiful experiences and new challenges. She was someone who said yes to opportunities that scared her, who trusted her own judgment, who believed she deserved joy not as a reward for service, but as a fundamental human right. As I packed, I found myself placing my old clothes, the practical pieces I had worn for the journey here, at the bottom of the suitcase. They felt like costumes from a play I was no longer interested in performing, uniforms from a job I had resigned without quite realizing it. The woman who had worn those clothes had been someone who made herself small, who apologized for taking up space, who measured her worth by her usefulness to others. The transformation hadn't been dramatic or sudden. There had been no lightning bolt moment of revelation, no single experience that had completely rewritten my understanding of myself. Instead, it had been accumulative, like layers of sediment building up until they formed new terrain. Each small choice to prioritize my own pleasure, each moment of allowing myself to be seen and appreciated, each experience of competence and capability had contributed to a fundamental shift in how I saw myself and what I believed I deserved. Breakfast on my final morning was served on my private deck, prepared by Chef Antoine as a personal farewell. Over the week, he had become something between a teacher and a friend, someone who understood that food could be a language of care and creativity, rather than obligation. This morning's meal was a love letter to the flavors I had discovered during my stay. Passion fruit and guava, freshly caught mahi-mahi prepared with island spices, coffee beans grown on a neighboring island and roasted that morning. "This week you have learned to taste again," Chef Antoine observed as he arranged the final plate. "When you arrived, you ate like someone who had forgotten that food could be pleasure. Now you eat like someone who understands that nourishing yourself is an act of love." His words struck me as profoundly accurate. At home, meals had become fuel, consumed quickly between other activities, chosen for convenience and nutritional efficiency rather than joy or discovery. This week, I had rediscovered eating as a sensual experience, had learned to appreciate the way flavors developed and combined, had taken time to notice texture and aroma, and the way beautiful presentation could enhance satisfaction. But it wasn't just about food. I had relearned how to experience pleasure in general, how to receive beauty and luxury and attention without the guilt that had shadowed every indulgence for decades. The old Ethel would have felt uncomfortable being served breakfast on a private deck, would have insisted on clearing her own plates, would have apologized for taking up so much of the chef's time. This new Ethel accepted the attention gracefully, understanding that allowing others to care for her was not selfishness, but a form of reciprocity that honored their expertise and hospitality. After breakfast, I took a final swim in the lagoon, floating on my back while staring up at a sky so blue it seemed artificial. The water was perfectly warm, the color of liquid emeralds, so clear I could see every detail of the coral formations below. Schools of tropical fish moved beneath me like living confetti, their colors so vivid they seemed to have been painted by someone with access to pigments that didn't exist in the ordinary world. As I floated there, I thought about the various activities and adventures that had filled my week. The snorkeling expedition where I had discovered underwater caves that looked like cathedrals. The cooking classes where I had learned that creativity in the kitchen could be a form of meditation. The sailing lessons that had taught me about partnership with natural forces rather than dominance over them. The rock climbing that had shown me I was stronger and braver than I had believed possible. Each experience had been a small rebellion against the version of myself I had inhabited for decades. The woman who had believed she was too old for new adventures, too inexperienced for physical challenges, too practical for luxury, too responsible for pure pleasure. This week had systematically dismantled those limiting beliefs, not through argument or analysis, but through direct experience of their falseness. I had climbed rocks and sailed boats and caught fish and danced on beaches. I had eaten foods I couldn't pronounce and learned skills I had never imagined attempting. I had made friends with strangers and discovered that I was interesting enough to hold my own in conversations with accomplished worldly people. I had spent money on myself without guilt and enjoyed luxury without apology. More importantly, I had learned to be alone without being lonely. The old Ethel had equated solitude with rejection, had interpreted time by herself as evidence that she wasn't wanted or needed by others. This week had taught me the difference between being alone and being lonely, had shown me that solitude could be a choice rather than a punishment, a space for self-discovery rather than isolation. In the early afternoon, I had my final spa treatment, a massage that felt like a benediction for the week's transformation. Sage, the therapist who had worked with me twice before, seemed to understand that this session was about integration, rather than just relaxation, about helping me embody the changes I had experienced, rather than simply relieving physical tension. "You carry yourself differently now," she observed as her hands worked to release the last traces of stress from my shoulders and neck. "When you first came here, your body was armored, ready for the next demand or emergency. Now you move like someone who trusts that she is safe, that she has time to breathe." As her skilled hands worked, I reflected on the truth of her observation. The constant state of hypervigilance that had characterized my daily life at home, the way I had moved through the world perpetually ready to solve problems and meet needs, had given way to something more relaxed and trusting. I had learned to inhabit my body as a source of pleasure rather than just a tool for service. The massage concluded with a ceremony that Sage had created specifically for guests who were transitioning back to their regular lives after transformative experiences. She anointed my forehead with essential oils that smelled like paradise, and spoke words of intention about carrying the peace and joy I had found back into my daily world. "Remember," she said as she placed her hands on my shoulders in a gesture of blessing, "you do not leave this version of yourself on the island. She comes home with you. She is who you always were beneath the roles and expectations. Your job now is to create space for her to flourish in your regular life." That evening, my last at the resort, was marked by a sunset dinner with the friends I had made during my stay. Margaret, Elena, David and I gathered at a table positioned to capture the full spectacle of the Caribbean sunset, and we lingered over our meal as the sky transformed through every possible shade of gold and orange and pink. The conversation was rich and meandering, covering everything from travel plans to life philosophy, to the books we had read that had changed our perspectives. What struck me most was how naturally I participated, how easily I shared stories and opinions and experiences without the self-censoring that had become automatic in most of my social interactions at home. "I have to say," Elena commented as we shared a dessert that was almost too beautiful to eat, "you seem like a completely different person than the woman who arrived here a week ago. Not different in your essential self, but different in your comfort with that self." Margaret nodded enthusiastically. "I noticed it too. You've gone from someone who seemed to be apologizing for taking up space to someone who clearly belongs wherever she chooses to be." Their observations meant more to me than they could know. These people had no investment in maintaining any particular version of me, no history that would bias their perceptions. If they could see such a dramatic change, then perhaps the transformation I felt was real rather than just wishful thinking. David raised his wine glass in a toast to Ethel, who has reminded us all that it's never too late to remember who we really are. As we clinked glasses and watched the sun disappear into the Caribbean, I felt a deep sense of gratitude, not just for the experiences I had enjoyed, but for the courage I had found to claim them. 6 months ago, the idea of taking a solo vacation to an expensive resort would have seemed impossible. Not because of financial constraints, but because of psychological ones. I wouldn't have believed I deserved such an experience, wouldn't have trusted myself to enjoy it, wouldn't have had the courage to travel alone. But I had done it. I had prioritized my own happiness over everyone else's comfort with my choices. I had spent money on myself without guilt. I had tried new things and met new people and discovered capabilities I hadn't known I possessed. I had proven to myself that I was interesting enough, brave enough, worthy enough to create my own adventures. After dinner, I took a solitary walk along the beach, my feet sinking into sand that was still warm from the day's sun. The moon was nearly full, casting a silver path across the water that seemed to lead toward infinite possibilities. The air was soft and warm, perfumed with jasmine and salt, and the only sounds were waves gently lapping at the shore and the distant laughter of other guests enjoying their evening. As I walked, I thought about my family and how our relationships might change as a result of this week. The conversations I had had with Marcus, Sophia, and Tyler had already shown signs of shift. Moments of recognition that perhaps they had been taking me for granted. Instances of genuine curiosity about my experiences, rather than just confirmation that their needs were being met. But more importantly, I had changed. I was no longer the woman who would automatically say yes to any request, who would sacrifice her own desires to accommodate others' preferences, who would make herself invisible to avoid creating inconvenience. I was someone who had tasted freedom and adventure and luxury, someone who had rediscovered her own capacity for joy and growth and courage. The challenge would be maintaining this sense of self back home, in an environment where old patterns and expectations would exert their familiar pull. I would need to be intentional about creating space for this version of myself, protective of the boundaries I had learned to establish, committed to prioritizing my own well-being alongside my care for others. But I felt confident in a way I hadn't in years. This week had proven that I was capable of more than I had believed, deserving of more than I had claimed, strong enough to choose myself even when that choice disappointed others. Those weren't lessons that could be unlearned, discoveries that could be forgotten, capabilities that could be erased. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Have a safe flight tomorrow. Looking forward to hearing about your week." I smiled as I typed my response. "Looking forward to showing you who I've become." As I made my way back to my overwater bungalow for the last time, I felt a sense of completion that was different from the endings I was accustomed to. Usually, the conclusion of a vacation was marked by sadness and anxiety, regret about returning to routine and responsibility. This felt more like graduation, like the successful completion of a course in self-discovery that had prepared me for the next phase of my life. I spent my final hour on the deck of my bungalow, sipping a glass of champagne while watching the moonlight dance on the lagoon. The tropical fish that had become my companions over the week continued their nightly ballet beneath the glass floor panels, oblivious to the significance of this moment for the human observer above them. I thought about the woman who had boarded a plane in Chicago a week earlier, hurt and angry and determined to prove a point about her own worth. That woman had been focused on what she was leaving behind, on the rejection she was escaping, on the statement she was making through her absence. This woman, the one preparing to return home tomorrow, was focused on what she was bringing back. New confidence, expanded horizons, a deeper understanding of her own capabilities and desires. She wasn't returning to make a point, but to build a life that honored the person she had rediscovered. I raised my glass to the moon and made a silent promise to myself. I would not allow this transformation to be temporary. I would not return to making myself small to accommodate others' discomfort with my growth. I would continue to invest in my own happiness, to seek out new experiences, to trust my own judgment about what would bring me joy and fulfillment. This week in paradise had not been an escape from my life, but a reclamation of it. And tomorrow I would begin the work of creating a home for this new version of myself in the world I had temporarily left behind. The next morning's departure felt ceremonial rather than melancholy. I packed my final items with the same deliberate care I had brought to every other activity during my stay, treating each piece of clothing and souvenir as a tangible reminder of the experiences that had transformed me. The shells I had collected during beach walks, the cookbook Chef Antoine had given me, the journal where I had recorded my daily adventures, all became talismans of the woman I had become. Celeste, the guest relations manager who had welcomed me a week earlier, personally escorted me to the seaplane dock, carrying herself with the dignity of someone presiding over an important ceremony. "We have loved having you with us, Mrs. Crawford," she said as we waited for the plane to complete its pre-flight preparations. "You arrived as one person, and you are leaving as another. That is the greatest compliment you could pay to our little island." Her words captured something I had been struggling to articulate. This week had not been about becoming someone different, but about becoming more fully myself, about stripping away the layers of limitation and obligation that had obscured my authentic nature. I was returning home as the person I had always had the potential to be but had never given myself permission to become. The seaplane ride back to Nassau provided a perfect aerial farewell to the island that had hosted my transformation. From above, Compass Cay looked like a jewel dropped into silk, its beaches pristine white against water so blue it seemed to glow from within. The overwater bungalows where I had spent my week appeared tiny from this height, but I could see my former home among them, the deck where I had eaten meals prepared just for me, the hammock where I had read novels chosen purely for pleasure, the steps leading down into water where I had learned to snorkel and swim with tropical fish. As the island grew smaller behind us, I felt no sadness about leaving. Instead, I felt gratitude for the experiences I had been bold enough to claim and excitement about the life I was ready to create. This place would always exist in my memory, as the location where I had remembered how to prioritize my own happiness. But I was no longer dependent on external paradise to access that version of myself. The flight back to Chicago was comfortable in a way the outbound journey hadn't been. A week earlier, I had been fleeing something, running away from hurt feelings and limited expectations. Now I was returning to something, carrying new understanding and capabilities back to the people and places I loved. The difference was subtle but profound, the distinction between escaping and choosing, between reacting and responding. I used the travel time to begin planning how I would integrate my week's discoveries into my daily life. Not the specific activities which would need to be adapted to Midwestern reality, but the underlying principles that had made this week so transformative. The commitment to new experiences, the practice of prioritizing my own desires, the willingness to invest in my own happiness, the courage to disappoint others when necessary to honor myself. I made a list in my journal of changes I wanted to implement immediately. Solo trips would become a regular part of my life, not as escapes from my family, but as investments in my continued growth and happiness. I would take cooking classes in Chicago, not to become more efficient in my meal preparation, but to rediscover the creative and sensual pleasures of working with beautiful ingredients. I would sign up for sailing lessons on Lake Michigan, continue the education that had begun in the Caribbean. I would say no to requests that diminished my energy without apologizing or over-explaining. Most importantly, I would stop measuring my worth by my usefulness to others. The week at Compass Cay had proven that I was interesting and capable and deserving of beautiful experiences, entirely independent of my roles as wife and mother. Those roles remained important to me, but they would no longer be the only lenses through which I viewed myself. As the plane descended toward O'Hare, I could see the familiar landscape of my home spreading below us. The sight filled me with affection rather than dread, curiosity rather than resignation. I was eager to see how my family would respond to the woman I had become, interested in discovering what kind of relationships we might build when I was no longer willing to make myself invisible for their comfort. Marcus was waiting for me at baggage claim, and the first thing I noticed was how carefully he was watching my face, as if trying to determine what he would find there. I smiled at him with genuine warmth, and I saw surprise and relief flicker across his features. "Welcome home," he said, kissing me with more attention than such kisses had received in years. "You look incredible. Rested and happy and somehow different." "I feel different," I said simply. "I feel like myself." As we drove home through familiar streets, I told him about my week, but I found myself focusing on how I had felt during various experiences rather than just the activities themselves. I described the satisfaction of learning to sail, the meditative quality of snorkeling, the sensual pleasure of cooking with fresh ingredients, the confidence I had gained from successfully navigating solo travel. "It sounds like exactly what you needed," Marcus said, and I could hear genuine happiness for me in his voice. "I have to admit, when you first told me about this trip, I thought you were having some kind of crisis. But listening to you now, I think you were having the opposite. You were finding your way back to yourself." That evening, we had dinner at our kitchen table, the same table where I had spent countless meals managing everyone else's schedules and preferences. But something fundamental had shifted in how I inhabited that space. I was no longer the invisible facilitator of the family's needs, but a full participant in our shared life. Someone whose experiences and perspectives were worthy of attention and interest. Marcus asked thoughtful questions about my week, and I found myself sharing stories and insights with the enthusiasm of someone who had genuinely enjoyed her adventures. But more importantly, he began sharing details about his own week in ways that felt like conversation rather than status reports. He told me about a book he had read, a conversation with a neighbor, a project at work that was exciting him in ways he hadn't experienced in years. "You know what's funny?" he said as we cleaned up after dinner, working together with an ease that felt both familiar and renewed. "Your week away made me realize how much I've been going through the motions lately. Seeing how alive and engaged you are makes me want to find my way back to that kind of enthusiasm." I looked at him with interest, rather than the automatic concern that such a statement would have triggered before my trip. The old Ethel would have immediately begun problem-solving, asking questions about what changes he needed and how she could help facilitate them. This new Ethel was curious about his journey without feeling responsible for managing it. "What do you think that would look like for you?" I asked. "I don't know yet, but I think I'd like to find out." That night, as we lay in our familiar bed, I felt a sense of homecoming that was different from any I had experienced before. I wasn't returning to my old life but creating space for my new self within the relationships and responsibilities I had chosen. I was no longer someone who had to choose between personal fulfillment and family commitment, but someone who understood that the two could enhance each other when approached with intention and balance. I thought about my children, both still enjoying their Disney vacation according to their latest social media posts, and felt excited about the conversations we would have when they returned. Not because I wanted to prove any points about their treatment of me, but because I was curious about what kind of relationships we might build when I was no longer willing to be taken for granted. The woman who had left for the Caribbean a week earlier had been focused on what she was missing, what she had been denied, what others owed her. The woman who had returned was focused on what she wanted to create, what she was capable of achieving, what she could contribute to her own happiness and the well-being of the people she loved. As I drifted off to sleep in my own bed, surrounded by the familiar sounds and sense of home, I felt a deep sense of integration. I had not left Ethel Crawford behind on a Caribbean island. I had brought her home, stronger and clearer than she had ever been, ready to build a life that honored all of who she was and could become. The first test of my transformation came sooner than expected. I had been home for exactly 3 days when my phone rang at 7:30 in the morning, jarring me from the peaceful morning routine I had begun establishing. The caller ID showed Tyler's name, and I answered with the warm greeting I had always offered my children. "Mom, thank God you picked up." Tyler's voice carried the frantic edge I had become accustomed to over the years, the tone that signaled another crisis requiring my immediate intervention. "I'm in a complete panic here. Remember that big corporate shoot I told you about? The one with the downtown hotel chain? Well, it's today, and my main camera just died. Like, completely dead. Won't turn on, nothing." I listened to his explanation while preparing my morning coffee, using the French press I had purchased after returning home, a small luxury inspired by the care and attention that had gone into every meal at Compass K. The old Ethel would have already been mentally calculating drive times to camera shops, calling in favors with photographer friends, rearranging her day to solve this emergency. "That sounds really stressful," I said, settling into my favorite chair with my coffee. "What are you thinking of doing about it?" There was a pause, clearly not the response Tyler had expected. "Well, I was hoping you could help me figure it out. Maybe call around to some rental places? You're so much better at this kind of research than I am, and I'm too stressed to think straight." I took a sip of my coffee, noticing how the morning light streamed through the kitchen windows in a way I had never really observed before. One of the gifts of my week away had been the rediscovery of small pleasures, the ability to notice beauty in ordinary moments instead of rushing through them toward the next obligation. "Tyler, you're a professional photographer," I said gently. "I'm sure you know more about camera rental places in the city than I do, and you've handled equipment emergencies before. But Mom, you always know how to fix these things. You have that way of finding solutions when I'm too panicked to think clearly." His words crystallized something I had been reflecting on since my return. For years I had been so eager to demonstrate my value through problem-solving that I had inadvertently trained my children to see me as their first line of defense against life's challenges. In trying to be helpful, I had actually hindered their development of independence and resilience. "I have confidence that you'll figure this out," I said. And Tyler? I'd love to hear how the shoot goes once you've handled the equipment situation. After we hung up, I felt something I hadn't expected. Pride mixed with a touch of sadness. Pride in my ability to resist the automatic impulse to take responsibility for someone else's problem. Sadness for the years I had spent believing that my worth was measured by my ability to rescue others from the consequences of their poor planning or bad luck. My phone buzzed with a text 30 minutes later. Found a rental place downtown. Thanks for believing in me, Mom. Sometimes I forget I can handle things myself. That message felt like a small victory. Evidence that stepping back from my role as chief problem solver might actually benefit my children as much as it benefited me. They had become so accustomed to my immediate intervention that they had stopped developing their own crisis management skills. By refusing to enable their dependence, I was giving them the opportunity to rediscover their own competence. The second test came that afternoon, when Sophia called from Northwestern with what had become a familiar refrain. Mom, I need to ask you a huge favor. I know you just got back from your trip, but I'm absolutely drowning here. I have 3 papers due next week, my sorority formal is this weekend, and I completely forgot that I promised to help organize the alumni networking event. Could you maybe write up some talking points for the networking thing? You're so good at that kind of professional communication, and I just don't have time. I listened while folding laundry, another mundane task that I had learned to approach with mindfulness rather than rushing efficiency. The clothes I was folding included several pieces I had worn during my Caribbean adventure, and touching them reminded me of the woman I had become, someone who valued her own time and energy as much as everyone else's. Sophia, it sounds like you've overcommitted yourself, I said, continuing to fold with deliberate care. That's a skill you'll need to develop as you move into your career. But Mom, you could write those talking points in like 20 minutes. It would take me hours because I'm not good at that stuff. Then maybe this is a good opportunity to get better at it. I could hear the surprise in her voice when she responded. Are you seriously not going to help me? I'm not going to do the work for you, I said, but I'm happy to listen if you want to talk through your approach or brainstorm ideas. There was a long silence, and I could practically hear her recalibrating her expectations of our conversation. This is about the Disney thing, isn't it? She said finally. You're punishing us for not inviting you. Her accusations stung, but it also clarified something important for me. In Sophia's mind, my refusal to enable her last-minute requests was punishment rather than boundary setting, retaliation rather than healthy relationship dynamics. This isn't about punishment, sweetheart. This is about me learning to say no to requests that treat my time as less valuable than yours. And it's about you learning that part of being an adult is managing your own responsibilities. But you've always helped with this kind of stuff. Yes, I have. And I think that's done both of us a disservice. You've become dependent on my rescue, and I've become resentful about constantly bailing you out of situations that result from your poor planning. After we hung up, I sat in my living room and marveled at how different that conversation had felt from countless similar exchanges over the years. Instead of the familiar pattern of crisis, rescue, and resentment, I had maintained my boundaries while offering emotional support. I had refused to enable her dependence while expressing confidence in her capabilities. The old Ethel would have spent the rest of the day writing networking talking points while silently resenting the imposition. This new Ethel spent the afternoon reading a novel in her garden, enjoying the spring sunshine and the satisfaction of time spent purely for her own pleasure. That evening, Marcus and I had our first real conversation about how my transformation was affecting our marriage. He had been watching my interactions with the children with what looked like a mixture of admiration and concern, clearly recognizing that something fundamental had shifted in my approach to family dynamics. I have to admit, he said as we shared a bottle of wine on our back patio, I'm impressed by how you handled Tyler and Sophia today. But I'm also a little worried about what this means for us. I looked at him with genuine curiosity rather than the defensive anxiety such a statement would have triggered before my trip. What kind of concerns do you have? Well, if you're not going to automatically say yes to everything the kids ask for, does that mean you're going to start saying no to me too? His question revealed something I hadn't fully considered: how much our marriage had been built on my willingness to subordinate my needs to his preferences. The assumption that my availability was unlimited, my energy inexhaustible, my desires secondary. Marcus, when was the last time you asked me to do something I actually wanted to do? He looked confused by the question. What do you mean? I mean, when was the last time you said, Ethel, I'd love to take you to that art exhibit you mentioned, or let's plan a weekend around something you've been wanting to try? When was the last time you considered my preferences when making plans for us? He was quiet for a long moment, clearly searching his memory and finding it lacking. I guess I assumed that you were happy doing the things we always do. You never complained. I didn't complain because I didn't think my preferences mattered as much as keeping everyone else happy. But Marcus, I've spent 32 years prioritizing your comfort, your schedule, your interests. I've organized our social life around your business needs, planned our vacations around your work calendar, chosen restaurants based on your dietary preferences. But that's just how marriages work, isn't it? Someone has to handle the logistics. His response illuminated the fundamental misunderstanding that had shaped our relationship for decades. He had interpreted my constant accommodation as preference rather than sacrifice, had assumed that my lack of expressed desires meant I had none. It's how our marriage has worked, I said gently, but I don't think it's how it needs to continue working. So what are you saying? You want me to start handling all the social planning? I laughed, recognizing that his first instinct was to swing to the opposite extreme, rather than finding a middle ground that honored both of our needs and preferences. I'm saying I want us to start making decisions together, based on what we both want rather than just defaulting to what's easiest or most familiar. I want you to start asking what I'm interested in doing, instead of assuming I'll go along with whatever you choose. And if what you want conflicts with what I want, then we negotiate like equal partners instead of you deciding and me accommodating. That conversation continued late into the evening, covering territory that we had never explored in 3 decades of marriage. Marcus had always seen himself as considerate because he didn't demand unreasonable things. But he had never considered that his definition of reasonable might be shaped by my willingness to make everything seem easy and effortless. He had loved and appreciated the Ethel who made his life run smoothly, who anticipated his needs and preferences, who managed the emotional and logistical labor of our shared life. But he was struggling to envision what our relationship might look like with a partner who had her own agenda, her own non-negotiable priorities, her own expectations of reciprocity and consideration. I'm not trying to become difficult or demanding, I told him as we prepared for bed. I'm trying to become honest about what I want and need from our relationship. And I'm hoping you'll want to build something together that makes both of us happy, instead of just one of us comfortable. The next few days brought a series of small confrontations that tested my resolve and clarified the extent of the changes I was committed to making. Our dinner party routine, which had always involved me doing all the planning, shopping, cooking, and cleaning, while Marcus focused on being a charming host, suddenly became a point of negotiation. The Hendersons invited us for dinner last month, Marcus said, checking his calendar. We should have them over soon to reciprocate. That sounds nice, I said. When were you thinking of having them, and what did you want to prepare? Well, you always handle the menu planning. Whatever you think would be good. Marcus, I'm not automatically taking responsibility for entertaining anymore. If you want to invite them, then you need to participate in the planning and preparation. He looked genuinely puzzled by this boundary. But you're so much better at dinner parties than I am. I'm better at them because I've had years of practice while you focused on other things. If you want to get better at hosting, you'll need to start participating instead of just showing up. We eventually compromised on a plan where we would split the responsibilities. He would handle the menu planning and shopping, I would do the cooking, and we would clean up together. It was a small change, but it felt revolutionary to me, the difference between being an unpaid caterer and being a co-host. The children's return from Disney World provided another opportunity to test my newfound boundaries. They came home full of stories and photos, clearly having had exactly the vacation they had wanted. But they also returned with the expectation that life would immediately resume its familiar patterns, with me managing their transition back to reality. Mom, I need you to help me figure out my summer internship applications, Sophia announced within hours of walking through the door. The deadlines are coming up fast, and I need help with my resume and cover letters. I'd be happy to look over your materials once you've drafted them, I said. But I'm not going to write them for you. Tyler had a similar request about organizing his portfolio for a potential gallery showing, assuming I would take charge of the project management and logistics that he found overwhelming. I believe in your ability to handle this yourself, I told him. And I'm here if you want to talk through any specific challenges you run into. Both children seemed confused by my responses, clearly expecting the automatic assistance they had always received. But they also rose to the occasion in ways that surprised all of us. When forced to take responsibility for their own projects, they demonstrated competence and creativity that had been hidden by their dependence on my intervention. It's weird, Sophia observed one evening as we cleaned up after dinner together, a task she had volunteered for without being asked. You seem happier, but you're also less available. Does that bother you? I asked, genuinely curious about her perspective. At first it did. I was kind of annoyed that you weren't jumping in to fix everything like you used to. But honestly, it feels good to handle things myself. I forgot I was actually capable of solving my own problems. Her insight revealed something I had suspected but hadn't fully understood. My constant rescuing had not only exhausted me but had also undermined my children's confidence in their own abilities. By always stepping in to handle challenges for them, I had inadvertently sent the message that I didn't trust them to be competent adults. Meanwhile, Tyler was discovering his own organizational skills, systems that worked better for his personality than the ones I had always imposed when taking over his projects. I never realized I was actually pretty good at planning when I'm not stressed about disappointing you, he told me during one of our conversations about his gallery project. When you were always ready to take over, I think I just gave up trying because I knew you'd do it better anyway. These conversations with my children were revealing how much our family dynamics had been shaped by patterns that served no one well. My martyrdom had created dependency, their dependency had created resentment, and the resentment had created distance that everyone felt but no one had known how to address. But the most significant change was in my relationship with Marcus. As I stopped automatically accommodating his preferences and started expressing my own, we began having conversations that felt more like partnerships than assignments. He started asking what I wanted to do on weekends instead of announcing plans he had made. He began noticing when I was tired or stressed, instead of assuming I was endlessly available for whatever needed to be done. I have to tell you something, he said one evening as we sat on our back patio sharing a bottle of wine and watching the sunset. I was afraid that if you stopped being the woman who handled everything, I wouldn't know how to love the woman you became instead. I felt my heart tighten at his honesty, recognizing the fear that lived underneath his resistance to my changes. And now? I asked. Now I'm realizing that I never really knew the woman you were underneath all that handling. I fell in love with your competence and your generosity, but I never took the time to discover what you were passionate about, what excited you, what you dreamed about when you weren't focused on making everyone else's dreams come true. So, what do you think about the woman you're discovering? He reached for my hand, squeezing it with an attention that felt different from the absent-minded affection that had characterized our physical contact for years. I think she's fascinating. I think I want to spend the next 30 years getting to know her properly. That night, we made love with a presence and attention that felt entirely new, as if we were discovering each other after decades of living parallel lives. The woman who had returned from the Caribbean was not just more confident in her own worth, but more available for genuine intimacy, no longer distracted by the mental task lists that had always competed for her attention. As spring progressed into early summer, the changes I had initiated began creating ripple effects throughout our family system. The children started planning their own social activities instead of expecting me to coordinate their calendars. Marcus began taking initiative in areas of our shared life that he had always left to me. Most importantly, we all started having conversations about desires and preferences, instead of just assuming that things would continue as they always had. But the real test of my transformation came when my sister Margaret called with news that would have sent the old Ethel into immediate caretaking mode. "Ethel, I need to tell you something and I don't want you to panic," Margaret said, her voice carrying the carefully controlled tone people use when delivering difficult news. "Robert and I are getting divorced." My first instinct was the familiar surge of problem-solving energy, the immediate mental shift into crisis management mode. The old Ethel would have immediately started asking about logistics. Where would Margaret live? How could I help with the transition? What did she need me to do to support her through this difficult time? Instead, I took a deep breath and listened. I'm so sorry, Margaret. This must be incredibly difficult for you. It is. But honestly, it's also been a long time coming. We've been growing apart for years, and the pandemic just made it impossible to ignore how little we actually enjoy each other's company anymore. I listened as she explained the situation, offering empathy and asking questions that helped her process her feelings, rather than immediately jumping into solutions and interventions. I have to say, Margaret observed after we had talked for nearly an hour, you're handling this very differently than I expected. What do you mean? I was bracing myself for you to immediately start planning how to fix everything, offering to let me move in with you, wanting to coordinate family responses. But instead you're just, listening. Is that what you need right now? Someone to listen? Actually, yes. I think it is. I've been so focused on the practical aspects of divorce that I haven't really processed the emotional side. It's nice to have someone who isn't immediately trying to solve it for me. That conversation marked another milestone in my ongoing transformation. I was learning to offer presence instead of solutions, to trust other people's ability to navigate their own challenges, to be supportive without being controlling. But perhaps the most significant change was in how I approached my own desires and goals. The woman who had returned from the Caribbean had tasted the satisfaction of prioritizing her own growth and pleasure, and she was not willing to give that up for the comfort of familiar routines. I enrolled in a weekly sailing class at the yacht club on Lake Michigan, something I had always wanted to do but had never prioritized because it didn't benefit anyone else in the family. I joined a book club that focused on contemporary literature rather than the practical nonfiction that had dominated my reading for years. I started taking weekend photography workshops, not because I wanted to become a professional photographer, but because I was curious about learning to see the world through a different lens. Each of these activities was chosen purely for my own enjoyment and growth, without consideration for how they might serve my family's needs or fit into their schedules. For the first time in decades, I was building a life that reflected my own interests and passions, rather than just supporting everyone else's. You seem busier lately, Marcus observed one evening as I prepared to leave for book club. I'm not busier, I corrected. I'm just busy with different things. Things I choose instead of things I'm assigned. The distinction was important, and I could see him processing the difference. For years, my schedule had been entirely reactive, filled with activities and obligations that served other people's needs and priorities. Now I was being proactive about creating experiences that enriched my own life, and the difference in my energy and enthusiasm was apparent to everyone around me. The children noticed it too. When I picked up new skills or tried new activities, they started asking genuine questions about my experiences, instead of just acknowledging them politely before moving on to their own concerns. Mom, that sailing photo you posted is incredible, Tyler said during one of our phone conversations. You look so happy and confident. It's making me think I should try some new things too. What kinds of things interest you? I asked. I don't know. I feel like I've been so focused on building my photography business that I've forgotten to have hobbies that are just for fun. His observation reflected something I was noticing in all of my family members. By modeling a life that included personal growth and pleasure alongside responsibility and obligation, I was giving them permission to expand their own definitions of what adult life could include. As summer approached, we began planning our first family vacation since my solo trip to the Caribbean. But this time, the planning process looked entirely different. Instead of me researching options and presenting them for approval, we all participated in brainstorming destinations and activities that would appeal to everyone. What about a cabin in Colorado? Sophia suggested during one of our family planning calls. Somewhere we could hike and maybe try whitewater rafting? That sounds amazing, Tyler said. I've always wanted to photograph mountain landscapes. What do you think, Ethel? Marcus asked. And I noticed that he was actually waiting for my response instead of just assuming I would go along with whatever the majority preferred. I love the idea, I said, and I'd like to research some spas in the area where I could book a massage or treatment. I want to make sure this vacation includes some relaxation time for me. It was a small request, but it represented a fundamental shift in how I approached family activities. Instead of focusing exclusively on what would make everyone else happy, I was including my own preferences as a legitimate part of the planning process. Of course, Marcus said immediately. We should all think about what would make the vacation special for us individually, as well as what we want to do together. That evening, as I sat in my garden with a glass of wine and my journal, I reflected on how much had changed in the months since I had boarded a plane to the Caribbean. The woman who had taken that trip had been running away from a life that felt constraining and unsatisfying. The woman sitting in this garden was actively building a life that honored all aspects of who she was and who she wanted to become. The transformation hadn't been without challenges. There had been moments of guilt when I said no to requests that would have been automatic yes responses in the past. There had been periods of anxiety about whether my family would still love me if I stopped being endlessly accommodating. There had been times when I questioned whether I was being selfish or unreasonable in my new expectations and boundaries. But there had also been moments of profound satisfaction when I saw my children rise to challenges they had previously expected me to handle. There had been experiences of genuine intimacy with Marcus as we learned to relate to each other as equals, rather than manager and managed. There had been the deep pleasure of pursuing interests and activities that fed my soul rather than just fulfilling my obligations. Most importantly, there had been the gradual recognition that loving my family well did not require sacrificing my own well-being. In fact, the more I honored my own needs and desires, the more present and generous I became in my relationships with them. When I stopped giving from a place of depletion and resentment, I rediscovered the joy of giving from abundance and choice. As the sun set over my garden, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that reminded me of Caribbean sunsets, I felt a deep sense of gratitude for the courage I had found to choose myself. That solo trip had been the beginning of a journey that was far from over, but I was no longer traveling towards some unknown destination. I was creating a life that felt authentically mine, one choice at a time. A year later, I found myself standing on the deck of a sailboat on Lake Michigan, teaching my granddaughter Emma how to read the wind. At 8 years old, she had the same fearless curiosity that had once characterized Sophia and Tyler before. Life taught them to be cautious about new experiences. Emma's small hands gripped the tiller with determination as I adjusted the mainsail, and her face lit up with pure joy as the boat responded to the wind's direction. "Grandma Ethel, look how fast we're going," she called out, her hair streaming behind her in the breeze that powered our small craft across the choppy waters of the lake. "You're doing beautifully, sweetheart," I called back, marveling at how natural this felt, sharing something I loved with someone I adored without the complicated layers of obligation and management that had once characterized my relationships with family members. Emma was Tyler's daughter, born to him and his wife Rachel just 2 years after his photography business had taken off in ways that surprised everyone, including Tyler himself. The confidence he had developed after learning to solve his own problems had translated into business success, creative risk-taking, and eventually meeting Rachel at a gallery opening where his work was featured. As we sailed back toward the harbor, Emma chattering excitedly about everything she had observed during our afternoon on the water, I reflected on how dramatically our family had evolved since that pivotal week in the Caribbean. The ripple effects of my transformation had touched every relationship, every dynamic, every assumption we had held about how families were supposed to function. Sophia had graduated from Northwestern with honors and immediately landed a position with an international consulting firm that specialized in sustainable business practices. But more importantly, she had learned to advocate for herself, to negotiate for what she wanted, to build relationships based on mutual respect rather than one-sided giving. Her wedding to David, a fellow consultant she had met during a project in renewable energy, had been a true collaboration where both families contributed ideas, resources, and effort, instead of one person bearing the entire burden of coordination. I had watched with pride as Sophia planned her own engagement party, managed her own vendor relationships, and made decisions based on what she and David actually wanted, rather than what they thought would please everyone else. When she asked for my help, it was specific and respectful, recognizing that my time and energy were valuable resources rather than unlimited utilities. Tyler's transformation had been equally remarkable. The young man who had once panicked at equipment failures and expected immediate rescue had become someone who approached challenges with creative problem-solving and calm persistence. His photography had evolved beyond commercial work to include fine art pieces that were being displayed in galleries throughout the Midwest. His confidence behind the camera had translated into confidence in life, leading him to Rachel and to a level of emotional maturity that allowed him to be a true partner in their relationship. But perhaps the most significant change had been in my marriage to Marcus. The man who had once taken my constant accommodation for granted had become someone who actively sought to understand my perspectives, who planned surprises based on my interests, who shared domestic responsibilities without being asked or managed. Our relationship had evolved from a manager-employee dynamic to a genuine partnership where both of our dreams and desires carried equal weight. Just the month before, Marcus had surprised me with reservations at a cooking school in Tuscany, something he had booked after listening to me describe the joy I had found in my cooking classes with Chef Antoine in the Caribbean. But more than the gesture itself, what moved me was the attention it represented, the recognition that I was someone with passions worth nurturing, rather than just someone who nurtured everyone else's passions. I realized, he had said as he presented me with the travel documents, that in 33 years of marriage I had never planned a trip based entirely on what you wanted to experience. I want to change that. Quote, we had spent 10 days in a converted monastery outside Florence, learning to make pasta from scratch, foraging for wild herbs in ancient olive groves, and discovering wines from small family vineyards that had been operating for generations. But beyond the culinary education, it had been a second honeymoon with the people we had become. Two individuals who genuinely enjoyed each other's company, rather than two people who had simply grown accustomed to sharing space. As Emma and I secured the sailboat at its mooring, I thought about the upcoming family reunion we were planning for the following month. For the first time in years, everyone was genuinely excited about spending extended time together. Not because they felt obligated, but because they had rediscovered the pleasure of each other's company when no one was keeping score of who gave more or received more. Grandma Ethel, Emma said as we walked along the dock toward the parking lot, will you teach me how to cook like you learned in Italy? I would love that, I said, meaning it completely. The prospect of sharing culinary skills with Emma felt like pure joy rather than another task to be managed, another way to be useful rather than valued. That evening, Marcus and I attended the gallery opening where Tyler's latest series was being featured. The photographs, taken during a solo trip he had made to Iceland the previous winter, captured landscapes that seemed almost alien in their stark beauty. But what struck me most was how he moved through the gallery that night, confident in his work and comfortable with the attention it was receiving. I never could have done this trip 5 years ago, Tyler confided to me as we stood before his favorite piece in the collection, an image of the northern lights dancing over a frozen waterfall. I would have been too worried about logistics, too dependent on someone else to handle all the planning and problem solving. But after I learned to manage my own crises, traveling solo became something I actually wanted to try. His words reminded me of my own journey toward independence, the way that learning to prioritize my own needs had paradoxically made me more capable of genuine generosity toward others. When I stopped giving from obligation and started giving from choice, my relationships became more authentic and ultimately more satisfying for everyone involved. The gallery opening was also attended by Margaret, who had moved to Chicago after her divorce and was thriving in ways that surprised all of us. The crisis I had once anticipated needing to manage had become an opportunity for her own transformation. Without a relationship that had required her to constantly compromise her preferences, she had rediscovered interests and ambitions that had been dormant for decades. I started taking pottery classes, she told me as we admired Tyler's photographs together. Can you believe it? I'm 56 years old, and I'm learning to throw clay like a college freshman. But Ethel, it makes me so happy. I had forgotten what it felt like to create something beautiful just for the joy of creating it. Her experience reflected something I had observed in many of the women I had met since beginning my own journey of self-discovery. Once we gave ourselves permission to prioritize our own growth and happiness, dormant parts of ourselves began to flourish in ways that enriched not just our own lives, but the lives of everyone around us. As the evening wound down and we prepared to leave the gallery, Sophia approached me with David at her side. They had been married for 6 months now, and I could see in their interaction the kind of partnership I had worked to create with Marcus. Two people who clearly enjoyed each other's company and supported each other's individual growth. "Mom, we wanted to talk to you about something," Sophia said, her voice carrying excitement rather than the request for rescue tone that had once characterized so many of our conversations. "David and I have been talking about planning a big family trip for everyone next summer. Not just our immediate family, but Margaret, Rachel's parents, maybe even some of the cousins we haven't seen in years." "That sounds wonderful," I said, genuinely delighted by the prospect. "What did you have in mind?" "Well, that's the thing," David said with a grin. "We want to rent a villa in the Caribbean, somewhere big enough for everyone. We thought maybe you could help us choose the location, since you're the family expert on Caribbean travel now." Their request felt entirely different from the demands and expectations that had once exhausted me. They were asking for my expertise and experience while clearly intending to handle the logistics and coordination themselves. They wanted my input because they valued my knowledge, not because they expected me to take over the project. "I would love to help you research locations," I said. "And I have some contacts at travel agencies who specialize in group bookings who might be able to help with the logistics." As we discussed potential destinations and timing, I marveled at how natural it felt to be included as a consultant rather than assigned as a project manager. This was collaboration rather than delegation, partnership rather than service. The drive home that night gave Marcus and me the opportunity to debrief the evening's conversations and reflect on how far our family had come in just over a year. "Did you notice," Marcus observed as we navigated the familiar streets of our neighborhood, "how differently everyone talks to you now? There's a respect there that wasn't present before, an acknowledgement that your time and preferences matter." "I notice it too," I said, "but I think the biggest change is in how I respond to them. I'm not constantly anticipating their needs or feeling responsible for their emotional states. I can just enjoy their company without feeling like I need to manage their experiences. And they seem to enjoy your company more too. When you're not focused on what everyone else needs, you're more present for actual conversation and connection." His observation captured something essential about the transformation that had occurred. By learning to value myself as more than just a service provider, I had become someone whose company was genuinely sought rather than simply expected. My relationships with my family members had deepened as they transformed from functional interactions to genuine emotional connections. As we pulled into our driveway, I noticed the garden I had expanded over the past year, adding herbs and vegetables that I actually enjoyed growing, rather than just plants that required minimal maintenance. The space had become a reflection of my own growth, a place where I experimented with new varieties and techniques simply because they interested me. "I have something to tell you," Marcus said as we settled onto our back patio with glasses of wine, a nightly ritual we had established in the months following my return from the Caribbean. "I've been thinking about retiring early." His announcement surprised me, not because I hadn't noticed his increasing dissatisfaction with work, but because he had never before made major life decisions based on what would make him happy, rather than what seemed financially or professionally responsible. "What's prompting that thought?" I asked. "Honestly, watching you rediscover what brings you joy has made me realize how little joy I find in my current work. I've been successful, but I haven't been fulfilled. And I keep thinking about all the things I've always wanted to try but never prioritized, because they didn't seem practical or profitable." "What kinds of things?" "I've always been interested in woodworking. And I think I'd like to travel more, not just the business trips I've been taking for years, but real travel to places that interest me. Maybe even take some photography workshops from Tyler, learn to see the world the way he does." His words filled me with a happiness that went beyond personal satisfaction. This was what transformation looked like when it rippled outward, when one person's courage to choose authenticity gave others permission to examine their own lives and make changes that honored their true desires. "What would early retirement look like practically?" I asked, not because I was worried about the logistics, but because I was genuinely curious about his vision. "I've run the numbers, and we could make it work, especially if I pick up some consulting projects that actually interest me rather than just accepting everything that comes along. I think I'd like to build custom furniture, maybe even sell some pieces if they turn out well enough." As we talked late into the evening about his dreams and plans, I felt a deep sense of completion. The woman who had boarded a plane to the Caribbean nearly 2 years earlier had been running away from a life that felt constraining and unsatisfying. But she had inadvertently started a chain reaction that had transformed not just her own existence, but the lives of everyone she loved. My solo journey had given my family permission to prioritize their own growth and happiness. My boundary setting had taught them to solve their own problems and develop their own competence. My pursuit of personal interests had shown them that adult life could include joy and adventure alongside responsibility and obligation. Most importantly, my decision to value myself had taught them to value me in return, not as a service provider but as a whole person, worthy of love, respect, and consideration. As I prepared for bed that night, I caught my reflection in the bathroom mirror and smiled at the woman looking back at me. She was confident without being defensive, generous without being depleted, loving without being self-sacrificing. She had learned the difference between service and servitude, between supporting others and losing herself in their needs. This woman had plans of her own. Another sailing class starting next week, a photography exhibition she wanted to attend next month, a solo trip to Scotland she was considering for the fall. But she also had a family she genuinely enjoyed spending time with, a marriage that had evolved into true partnership, and grandchildren who saw her as someone with wisdom worth seeking, rather than just someone who provided services. The transformation that had begun with a single decision to prioritize her own happiness had created a life that honored all aspects of who she was. A woman who could love others fully because she had learned to love herself first. Someone who could give generously because she gave from abundance rather than depletion. A person who had discovered that choosing herself had been the greatest gift she could give to everyone she cared about. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.